Ladies and gentlemen, let us take a moment to confront a truth many would rather avoid: the cost of emotional detachment. We live in a time where the dance between intimacy and independence is fraught with confusion. But nothing sharpens clarity like loss. When the avoidantly attached individual finally truly realizes, that you're gone, something profound begins to unravel in their psyche, not just regret, not just longing, but an existential awakening. You see, they built a fortress around their heart, not because they didn't care, but because caring was dangerous. They spent years perfecting the art of distance, of cool detachment, equating vulnerability with weakness. They told themselves that needing someone was a flaw, that independence meant isolation, and that silence was safer than truth. And perhaps for a time it worked. But here's the truth, ladies and gentlemen: loss is a mirror. When the one who once stood by them finally walks away, not out of spite, but from necessity, it forces the avoidant to face the one thing they've run from all their lives, themselves. They begin to ask the hard questions. Why do I feel so hollow? Why didn't I fight for them? Why am I only now realizing what they meant to me? Because the truth is, the avoidant doesn't feel the loss immediately. It creeps in slowly. At first they tell themselves it's fine, that you'll come back, that they're better off, but then the silence becomes deafening, the world moves on, and you, the one who saw through them, are no longer available to rescue them from their emotional exile. And that's when the pain sets in. Not just the pain of losing you, but the pain of realizing they never let you fully in. The pain of understanding that connection, once severed, can't always be stitched back together. Especially when the other person has grown stronger, clearer, and no longer waits at the door. This is the paradox of the avoidant. They fear closeness but suffer in its absence. And when it's finally gone, when they feel your absence as a void rather than a relief, the transformation begins, not always immediately, not always visibly, but deeply, fundamentally. So what happens when the avoidant realizes they've truly lost you? They awaken, and in that awakening they either crumble, or change. Avoidants build emotional walls not from hatred, but fear of vulnerability and dependence. This fear often begins in early relational experiences. Somewhere along the line, the avoidant individual received the message, whether overtly or subtly, that emotional expression was unsafe. Perhaps it was a parent who withdrew affection in times of distress. Perhaps it was a home environment where needs were met with silence or dismissal. Whatever the cause, the message was clear: needing others is risky, and closeness brings pain. So they adapted. Like anyone trying to survive emotional uncertainty, they learned to shut down rather than speak up. They disconnected from their own inner emotional landscape to avoid the discomfort of being exposed, and over time, that disconnection became their normal. Not feeling deeply became a kind of protective mechanism, a way to prevent the loss they once couldn't bear. Their independence, though often praised by society, wasn't built on strength. It was built on defense. It was a shield, not a virtue. The avoidant doesn't necessarily hate closeness. In fact, many long for it in secret. But the idea of emotional interdependence triggers something primal in them. It threatens their carefully constructed internal world, one where self-sufficiency equals safety. So when love presents itself, when someone comes close and begins to see through the cracks, the avoidant pulls back. Not because they don't care, but because they care too much and don't know how to hold that kind of vulnerability without fearing it will consume or destroy them. This fear isn't always conscious. It shows up in subtle patterns. The avoidant may minimize your importance, not out of cruelty, but as a way to maintain psychological distance. They may make jokes when things get serious, disappear when emotions rise, or intellectualize feelings instead of experiencing them. These behaviors aren't just habits. They're reflexes developed over time to avoid the perceived danger of intimacy. They fear becoming dependent because, to them, dependence has always been paired with disappointment or betrayal. Somewhere deep inside, they believe that if they truly let someone in, they will be left hurt or abandoned. So better to maintain control, better to appear detached than be devastated by connection. This is why avoidants often feel a strange sense of safety in solitude. In being alone, there is no risk of rejection. There is no threat of abandonment when there is no one to abandon you, and yet this protective stance comes at a high cost. While they avoid the pain of connection, they also forfeit the joy of it. The warmth of being known, the richness of true intimacy, the safety of being emotionally held, these are experiences they often deny themselves. Not because they don't want them, but because they've never felt safe wanting them. The tragedy is, avoidants are not heartless. In fact, many have very rich inner emotional lives. They just keep those lives hidden even from themselves. Their walls are built from old wounds, unspoken fears, and the deep longing to be loved without the terror of losing themselves in the process. When you're close to someone avoidant, you might feel like you're always chasing something just out of reach. They can be physically present but emotionally distant, giving you glimpses of connection before retreating into themselves again. But it's important to understand this isn't about manipulation, it's about fear. A fear so deep, so ingrained, that even love feels like a threat. They may love you, they may think about you, they may feel things they don't have words for, but their conditioning, their wiring, tells them that love requires too much of them, more than they believe they're capable of giving. So they create space, not to punish but to protect. They seem cold not because they are, but because warmth has always come with risk. And in their minds, risk is synonymous with loss. To feel is to be exposed. And to be exposed is to be vulnerable to pain. So they build their walls, tall, silent, firm, and on the other side they watch, they wonder, they sometimes ache. But they stay hidden because the fear of being hurt outweighs the desire to be known. Until sometimes it doesn't, and by the time they realize that the walls they built to protect themselves have also kept love out, it's too late. The person on the other side has stopped knocking. The silence has become permanent. And the avoidant is left alone with the very thing they feared most. The consequences of emotional distance, true loss, doesn't register immediately for avoidant individuals. It sinks in slowly over time with growing intensity. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of people who exhibit avoidant attachment tendencies. To the outside world, it may appear that when a relationship ends, they move on quickly, almost indifferently. They might seem unaffected, even relieved, as though the bond that once meant everything to you meant very little to them. But this is a misreading. Not of what they feel, but of how they process what they feel. You see, avoidant individuals don't experience emotions the same way as others do, at least not on the surface. Their entire psychological framework has been designed to minimize emotional discomfort by pushing it out of conscious awareness. Rather than confront the pain of separation or the gravity of what's been lost, they suppress it, they intellectualize, they distract, they tell themselves it was inevitable or that they're better off. And for a while that narrative seems to work. They carry on, resume their routines, and maintain an image of control. There's no meltdown, no pleading, no outward mourning, but beneath that calm exterior, something different is happening. The emotional truth hasn't vanished. It's simply been buried, stored deep in the unconscious where it continues to simmer. And as time passes, cracks begin to form in the story they've told themselves. Moments that once seemed trivial start to resurface with weight. The way you used to laugh, the comfort of your presence, the quiet understanding that didn't need words. These memories begin to haunt them, not suddenly, but gradually. At first it's just a thought here and there, a passing reminder, then slowly it builds, something small, a song, a scent, a familiar location, triggers a flicker of pain, and because they've pushed these feelings away for so long, they don't know how to sit with them. So the discomfort grows, and it keeps growing. Where others might cry it out in the early stages of a breakup, the avoidant does the opposite. They suppress first, suffer later. That delayed emotional response is what makes it so hard for them to process loss in a healthy way. They've spent years avoiding vulnerability, so when the full weight of loss finally catches up, they're ill-equipped to handle it. There are no tools in their emotional toolbox for mourning, for reckoning, for closure. Instead, there is confusion, an ache they can't explain, a loneliness they don't know how to soothe, and worst of all, there's the dawning realization that they pushed away something, someone, that mattered more than they were willing to admit. But by the time this realization sets in, it's often too late. The other person has moved on. The door they assumed would always be open is now closed, and because they never practiced being emotionally available, they don't know how to reach out, how to apologize, how to fight for what's gone. So they sit in the silence, and that silence grows louder with time. This is the tragedy of the avoidance delayed grief. It's not that they don't feel, it's that they feel too late. Their hearts wake up long after the moment has passed. They begin to understand, months or even years later, what they truly had, and that slow awakening can be agonizing because they know, deep down, that the loss was avoidable, that their defenses, once their shield, have now become their prison. They might start to question everything, why they couldn't just open up, why they held back, why they needed so much space from the one person who only ever wanted to love them, and in that questioning, shame can emerge. A quiet, relentless shame that whispers, you had something good and you let it go, not because you didn't care, but because you were too afraid to show that you did. That's how it works. That's how true loss affects the avoidant. It doesn't strike like lightning. It seeps in like water through the cracks, slowly filling every hidden space until it becomes undeniable. The very feelings they tried to escape become inescapable. And the emotional reckoning, when it arrives, can be devastating, not just because of what they've lost, but because of how long it took them to see the value of what was right in front of them. And now they're left to face the quiet truth. It didn't hit them right away, but it hit them hard when they realize you're truly gone. It forces them to confront long, buried emotional wounds and unresolved inner conflicts. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, emotional separation isn't just about the end of a relationship. It is the dismantling of the protective structure they've spent a lifetime building. And when the reality sets in that you're no longer they're not just physically absent, but emotionally, spiritually, and mentally unavailable, it creates a shockwave through their system. Not a sudden burst of emotion, but a slow and unsettling unraveling. They've built their lives around the belief that needing someone is dangerous. Dependency to them equates to vulnerability. So when the relationship begins to crack, they retreat. It's almost automatic. They distance themselves emotionally and often physically, convinced that detachment is the safer path. In their mind, pulling away preserves their autonomy. It keeps the pain at bay. They may even believe they are handling things maturely, avoiding the chaos of emotional confrontation. But when the dust finally settles and they see you've moved on, that you are no longer reaching out, no longer responding to breadcrumbs, no longer waiting in the wings, they are faced with a confrontation they've avoided their entire lives. Not a confrontation with you, but with themselves. The silence becomes deafening, and into that silence creeps the reality they've buried for so long. They have wounds that were never healed, fears that were never voiced, and parts of themselves they've never truly faced. This is when the internal conflict begins to surface. They start to question their reactions, their coldness, their instinct to push away the very thing they yearned for in secret. At first, they may experience confusion. Why am I thinking about them so much? Why does this hurt more now than it did before? Why can't I move on the way I thought I would? These questions don't have easy answers because they are rooted in a psychological system designed to disconnect from emotion, not process it. And yet now they are alone with themselves. There's no one left to distract them, to chase them, to absorb their silence. There's only the weight of what's been lost and the realization that their coping mechanisms, dismissal, withdrawal, emotional suppression, didn't protect them from pain. They delayed it, buried it, but did not escape it, and in that space of loss something profound happens. The mask begins to slip. They begin to remember not just you, but everyone who came before you. The parent who never offered comfort, the early experiences of rejection or neglect, the relationships where love was conditional, where showing emotion invited shame. They begin to see patterns, and those patterns lead straight back to wounds they thought they'd outgrown, or worse, ones they never even acknowledged. But now, without your presence to deflect or blame, they are left with the source of the discomfort, themselves. And this is terrifying, because it means accepting responsibility. It means admitting they sabotaged something meaningful. It means understanding that their instinct to self-protect has cost them more than it ever saved. These realizations don't come all at once. They surface in fragments, memories, emotions, regrets, each one forcing them to look inward, each one exposing a deeper truth. They didn't just lose you, they lost the opportunity to heal through connection. They lost the chance to face their fears in the safety of your love. As this awareness deepens, they may experience emotional turmoil unlike anything they anticipated. What once felt like control now feels like isolation. What once looked like strength now feels like avoidance. And for the first time, they may understand that true intimacy requires risk. Not just the risk of being hurt, but the risk of being seen, of being known in all their flaws, fears, and imperfection. But you're not there anymore. You're not the soft landing they once took for granted. And so, they're forced to turn inward, to sit with discomfort, to confront their choices, and perhaps for the first time to acknowledge the pain that shaped them, the pain they projected onto you, onto love, onto connection. Whether or not they grow from this is uncertain. Some do. Some begin the long, difficult work of self-examination and healing. Others retreat even further, doubling down on the very defenses that caused their loss. But the awakening has already begun. The mirror has been placed before them. And what they see in that reflection is not just your absence, but everything they've been running from, now demanding to be faced. They begin to experience regret, self-doubt, and a yearning for what they dismissed emotional intimacy. At first, it's subtle, a quiet discomfort, a strange emptiness that they can't quite name. The avoidant person, long convinced that distance would protect them, begins to feel a pull, an ache they hadn't prepared for. They told themselves they didn't need closeness, that they were better off alone, that the connection they shared with you wasn't essential. But now, in your absence, that story begins to unravel. Regret creeps in slowly, like a shadow stretching across the floor in the late afternoon. It doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic confessions. Instead, it shows up in moments, in the memory of a laugh, a touch, a quiet glance shared across a crowded room. These moments, once easily brushed aside, now carry unexpected weight. They begin to realize that what they once dismissed as too much or too intense was in fact a kind of nourishment their soul had been starved for. They start to question their past decisions, not just the act of pulling away, but the reasoning behind it. Why did I shut them out? Why couldn't I just open up, even a little? Why did I choose silence over connection? The self-assurance that once defined them begins to crack, and into that crack pours uncertainty. What if I was wrong about all of it? What if what I ran from was exactly what I needed? Self-doubt is a painful teacher. It doesn't shout. It whispers, it unsettles. It rewrites the story they thought they understood. The very identity they clung to, that of the independent, self-sufficient, emotionally detached person, starts to feel hollow, because now they understand something they didn't see before. Being emotionally closed off didn't make them strong, it made them unreachable. And now, when they want to reach out, there's no one on the other end. The yearning begins to grow, not just for you specifically, but for the feeling they once had in your presence, that feeling of being known, understood, accepted. Emotional intimacy is not just about grand romantic gestures. It's about subtle safety. It's about being able to speak freely without fear of judgment. It's about having someone who sees your darkness and chooses to stay anyway. That's what they pushed away. That's what they now crave, and the irony is heavy. Only now, after it's gone, can they see its value clearly. They may try to replicate it elsewhere, hoping to distract themselves with new connections. But it's not the same. The depth isn't there. The safety isn't there. It feels forced, shallow, artificial, because the intimacy they now yearn for isn't something that can be rushed or faked. It was something that grew over time with you, something that required trust, openness, and consistency. And in avoiding those very things, they unknowingly sabotaged the very connection they now miss. This longing becomes internalized. They may not speak about it. They may not admit it to anyone. But it shows in their behavior, in the way they check your online status, revisit old photos, scroll through past conversations. They begin to replay moments, wondering what they could have done differently. They might even fantasize about reconciliation, about reaching out, about making it right, but the fear that once kept them from opening up still lingers, now tangled with shame and uncertainty, and so they sit with it. The regret, the doubt, the longing, all of it. They begin to see that emotional intimacy isn't weakness, it's not a trap, it's a gift, one they rejected because they were taught to fear it, one they miss now with an ache that's both emotional and physical. It's not just about missing you, it's about missing the version of themselves that felt alive, seen and connected when they were with you, a version they didn't know they could be because they'd spent so long hiding behind emotional armor. Now they're left with the truth, they dismiss something sacred, and in doing so they created a void, not a void that can be filled by another person, but one that demands a reckoning with the self. A confrontation with everything they refused to feel, everything they ran from, everything they didn't understand about love. They begin to realize that emotional intimacy wasn't the threat, they were. To themselves, to their own potential for connection, and now with the clarity of hindsight they finally see what they had, and what they lost. Your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was, highlighting the depth of what they've lost. It doesn't happen all at once. For the avoidant it builds slowly, a quiet unease at first. A silence that was once comfortable now becomes intrusive. They notice it in the spaces where your voice used to live, in the little moments where your presence used to bring warmth or clarity. The routines that once included you, without ceremony or obligation, now feel strangely incomplete. It's in these small voids that your absence begins to speak, and it speaks with increasing volume. At first, they try to ignore it. They tell themselves that everything is fine, that life goes on. They fall back into their patterns of self-reliance, their solitary rhythm. But even in the midst of distraction, something feels off. The space you left behind begins to take shape, and not just in a physical sense. It's an emotional presence that lingers, a resonance that cannot be muted. It's the absence of your energy, your reactions, your steadiness or your spontaneity, whatever it was that once surrounded them with a quiet familiarity. What they once considered noise, your emotional honesty, your desire for connection, your insistence on deeper communication, now echoes as clarity. The things they resisted or minimized become the very things they find themselves craving. The conversations they avoided, the affection they deflected, the moments they downplayed, each one returns to them now not as burdens, but as missed opportunities for real connection. They begin to realize that what they once held at a distance was not a threat to their freedom, but a doorway to something profound and rare. Your absence becomes a mirror. It reflects everything they refused to confront while you were there. The walls they built for protection are now barriers they don't know how to tear down, and with no one left on the other side trying to reach through, those walls feel heavier than ever. The silence becomes oppressive. What was once space they guarded so fiercely now feels more like exile, not because you took anything from them, but because they pushed away the one thing they secretly needed most, connection. Avoidants often convince themselves that they can live without closeness, that they are better off when no one is near enough to cause disruption or pain, but when someone like you leaves, not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, they are forced to confront the lie in that narrative. Because now they are alone, not just by choice, but by consequence, and that's a different kind of loneliness, one that stings with finality. They start to notice the changes in themselves. Perhaps they find it harder to enjoy things that used to bring them peace. The same music sounds dull, their favorite places feel empty, even their independence. The one thing they always clung to feels less like freedom and more like a prison sentence. That's the irony. They fought so hard for solitude, only to find that in solitude your absence roars. They begin to sense the emotional cost of their detachment, not just the loss of you, but the loss of the version of themselves they only knew through you, the version that could be vulnerable, open, and soft. That version didn't survive in the silence. It needed your presence to thrive, and without you, they are left with a shell of the life they had, and the self they were becoming in your presence. It's in this way that your absence becomes formative. It reshapes how they see love, how they see themselves, and how they understand what it means to truly lose someone, because losing someone isn't always about grand declarations or dramatic fallouts. Sometimes it's a slow, haunting realization that the daily things, the way you laughed, the way you challenged them, the way you stayed, mattered more than they were willing to admit, and now those things are gone. You don't have to say anything, you don't have to come back. Your silence, your absence is doing the work. It's calling out the truth louder than any confrontation ever could. They are left to sit with that truth, to wrestle with it, to try and understand how something so real, so grounding, could slip through their fingers. They thought detachment would spare them pain. Instead, it delayed it, and now it has arrived with force. And so your absence becomes not just a void, but a message, one they hear in every quiet moment, one they can't run from anymore, one that says, this is what you lost, and now you must feel it. This loss can either trigger deep personal growth, or spiral them further into isolation, depending on whether they face or flee their emotional truth. For the avoidant individual, reaching this crossroads is not simply about heartbreak. It's about reckoning with a lifetime of emotional avoidance. The end of a meaningful connection doesn't just leave a void. It uncovers layers of emotional debris they've spent years burying, and once uncovered, there's no easy way back to the comfort of emotional detachment. The only path forward is through, but here lies the paradox. The very defense mechanisms that once shielded them from vulnerability now stand in the way of their healing. Their instinct is to flee, to intellectualize, to distract, to convince themselves it was for the best. These are well-practiced habits, developed often in early life to survive emotional inconsistency, neglect, or trauma. So when this loss strikes, the fork in the road presents two painfully distinct options: evolution or regression. If they choose to face it, truly face it, it becomes the beginning of something profound. At first, it's terrifying. To acknowledge the pain is to admit that they cared far more than they let on. It's to dismantle the narrative that closeness is weakness, that independence is everything, that emotions are dangerous. It's to confront the fact that they lost someone not because they were unlovable, but because they never allowed themselves to be fully loved. This confrontation can be raw. It involves sitting in the discomfort, resisting the urge to shut down or lash out. It means tracing the root of their fear, looking back at the original wounds that taught them to build walls instead of bridges. But with that pain comes clarity. They begin to understand that vulnerability isn't the enemy. It's the doorway to connection, to wholeness, to a more grounded and authentic self. For the first time, they might recognize the value of emotional responsibility, not as a burden, but as a path to freedom. Growth then becomes possible. It's not linear, it's not clean, but it's real. They may seek therapy, they may begin journaling, meditating, or simply allowing themselves to feel what they once denied. Relationships might take on a new shape, not as threats, but as opportunities to practice what they never knew how to before: emotional presence. This is where transformation begins. In the wreckage of loss, they find the invitation to rebuild not just a better version of connection, but a better version of themselves. But not all avoidants will take this path. For many, the pain of introspection is too great. Facing their emotional truth would require them to tear down the identity they've carefully constructed over years, sometimes decades, and so they choose to flee. This doesn't look dramatic. It can be subtle, burying themselves in work, rebounding into shallow relationships, numbing with distractions, anything to avoid feeling. This avoidance, however, is not neutral. It deepens their isolation. Over time, it leads to a quiet inner erosion. They may become more rigid in their beliefs, more skeptical of others, more cynical about love. They might start to believe that no one is capable of understanding them, that intimacy is always a trap, that all connections are doomed. But deep down, what they are really avoiding is themselves, the wounded part of them that longs to be held, understood, and healed. As the years go by, that internal dissonance grows. They may accomplish great things externally, but the inner void remains untouched. Relationships may come and go, but none feel fulfilling. And the reason is simple. You cannot connect deeply with others if you are disconnected from your own emotions. The very wall they built to keep pain out has also kept joy, love, and meaning from fully entering. This is the spiral. It doesn't always look like suffering from the outside, but inside it's a silent suffocation, a quiet knowing that something essential was missed, not because it was never there, but because they refused to claim it when it was. And perhaps the most painful part of it all is the realization that the door to emotional growth was once wide open, and they walked past it, so the loss stands as a turning point, a mirror, a test. Do they turn inward and begin the difficult work of healing, or do they double down on the very defenses that caused the rupture in the first place? The answer defines not only how they handle this heartbreak, but how they will navigate every relationship to come. Growth or isolation, truth or avoidance, it's a decision no one else can make for them, but one that will shape the rest of their emotional life. So, when the avoidant realizes they've truly lost you, they are faced with a powerful choice. It's a choice that stands at the intersection of pain and potential, where the weight of their isolation forces them to confront the very thing they've spent their lives avoiding, themselves. It's in this painful truth that the opportunity for real transformation lies. But only if they are willing to embrace the vulnerability they have long rejected. In the end, the loss is not just about you, it's about them, about their fears, their wounds, their emotional walls, and ultimately about their growth. Will they face it and allow themselves to heal, or will they retreat into the very isolation that kept them from connection in the first place? That is the question, and how they answer it will shape not only their future relationships, but the person they choose to become. In the silence that follows your absence, there is a message of truth, of change, and perhaps of a new beginning, a chance to reclaim what they've lost, not just with you, but with themselves. And in that moment, the choice is theirs to make.